This session was titled Dissecting the Me Too Tsunami, and we've kind of been figuring out how do you dissect a tsunami. Before we start, I'll quickly introduce all the panelists. Paromita Vohra is a filmmaker and writer. Supriya Nair is a journalist based in Mumbai. Vivian Schiller describes herself as being at the intersection of media, journalism, and technology, and heads a civil foundation which works for the sustainability of trustworthy journalism across the world. Padmapriya is an actor who co-founded the Women in Cinema collective, which has been fighting Me Too battles from long before the hashtag became popular. Now, Me Too, obviously, as we all agree, was a transformative moment which shone a light on aspects of our society and our workplaces which had long been normalized and ignored. But what it also did, and what is the theme of this session, is in Paromita's words from yesterday, it asked, it raised the question, what does Me Too reveal of the media? And I'll turn to Paromita.
I think, obviously Me Too, as you said, reveals something to us about workspaces and all of life, in fact, and the relationship between the genders. But I think about the media, what we've seen is that the kind of sexism that exists from outside to inside, and the kind of news that is produced or the kind of media that is produced is deeply linked to the mindsets of people who are running news organizations and the structures of news organizations. So, for example, there has been for so long a hierarchy of, what is the most important subject and what should be on page one and what counts as important for the whole world to know. And things to do with women or queer people or Dalits are never those things. They're always like in a quota system. And the stuff that's on the front page, or important news, hard news as they call it, is almost always to do with conflict and other things which are then considered to be to do with men, right? So I do think that this attitude that, as a small aside, in the 30 years that I've been working mostly on feminist issues, I think I've been interviewed by maybe 100 journalists, and maybe one or two of them have been guys. So there's this thing, right? Like women will cover women's issues and men don't need to think about women. And writing about women, talking about women's issues is not part of the business of life and the world and as important as everything else. And I think when you minimize something so much, of course, you find these kinds of toxic workspaces occurring and creation of these kind of alpha guys who don't take no for an answer in any respect. And I think as we saw, like say in the story, the Weinstein story, these men don't only harass women, but they bully everybody else too, right? So there are these hierarchies around identity that are in workspaces, and the way that the media then covered Me Too, for example, was only very reactively. So it's women who stood up and spoke, and then the media has covered that. But if you look, and then one or two places, like say Caravan, did some investigative stories, detailed investigative stories. But it should be remembered that, like for example, some of the stories that were done, people in those stories had also been profiled in those very magazines before. Now, I think the important thing that it reveals is most of the men who were accused in Me Too, it's not really a surprise to anybody, right, what they did. These are open secrets, everybody has known about them. But no media house ever thought it was important to do an investigative story on sexual misbehavior and sexual misconduct in the workspace before Me Too happened. So in a sense, even afterwards, barring these one or two examples, it is women who are like fodder for the media. When they get raped, when they experience violence, when they die, then the media takes interest. And it only reports on that. It doesn't look at the larger kind of ecosystem that the media itself exists in and from which these stories get created and these experiences get created. So I think it reveals to us that we really need to strongly reflect on how to restructure media, restructure what we think news is and what we think is important to be talking about.
In fact, there's a very, I'm going to quote you to yourself now, there's a very memorable quote by you about how the media looks at women, where you say, quote, "Unless we are raped or killed, we are not newsworthy." Stop quote. Supriya, I'll turn to you now. My impression when Me Too broke and all the, and just looking at the media coverage of it essentially, was that the media was really, number one, taking its cues from Twitter. Whatever is in the news, they will report it. There won't be much independent investigation happening, barring a few people like Caravan who did some great stories or whatever. But the media's approach, especially the mainstream media's approach to Me Too, just seemed to be that, oh, this stuff is in the news, so-and-so has accused so-and-so of this, and it becomes a headline, and the next day it's gone, and there's no deeper sort of investigation. What are your views on that?
Thank you. Thanks, Amit. And I'm sorry about that, everyone. Right. Good morning. Women make news when we're raped or killed, and as the October 2018 wave of Me Too showed us, also when we generate content for free, which is what we did. I think you're broadly right about the engagement going, sort of going beyond the day one story or the day two story only in certain circumstances. Part of that, I think, is because our legacy media isn't very good at following up on stories. One of the reasons that waves of Me Too successively, both what happened in October 2018 and what happened a year earlier, as soon as the Weinstein story broke out, or soon after the Weinstein story broke out, which was the list of men in academia who were anonymously accused by women who had suffered sexual harassment at their hands, is that once those names were out there, very few organizations thought it was their responsibility, to follow any investigations that may have happened to the end. In fact, from the list of academics, I think there was one academic, and I don't want to take any names right now, simply because I don't want to focus our attention unduly on one particular case. If it comes to that, we can do that. There was one particular story that Scroll followed up on to the very end. Beyond that, I think how we covered Me Too was really reflective of how we cover a lot of serious stories in our media, and that does amount, how we cover national security and everything else. It's fundamentally part of our laziness, our feeling that we don't have enough resources to devote to this, our feeling, especially on TV, that we won't get ratings for this beyond the first sensational headline or debate. And that's something that we really need to think about, because the thing that I hope the Me Too conversation on social media made clear to a lot of people is that the ways in which women and their allies amplified and supported each other on social media was a lesson to the rest of us, and that there were truths, not just factual truths indicting individual men or organizations, but really deep emotional truths about how men behave with women, how the powerful behave with the powerless, and dissecting those hierarchies. A lot of that work was done informally among us in public. And so even when it moved from legal violations to ethical violations, you had stories okay, I'm breaking my own rule here. You had stories like the Aziz Ansari story, right, on babe.net in the US. And stories like it were, a few Indian media organizations tried to do the same thing. You realized that the impact that it had was very different. I don't want to criticize the decision to have told that story at all, because I think that was an important story to tell. But the motivations to put it up there online were very different from the motivations that women had when they were talking to each other about bad dates, about how men treated them, about this system that kind of sustains, that makes us feel bad about stuff. Those are the things I think we should reflect on.
So, Vivian, hearing about sort of the shallow coverage of the Indian media, taking cues from Twitter and so on, and not following up and doing investigative journalism. Now, you've been in the US media for decades, literally, and you've sort of followed... And you followed how that has evolved as well. So can you give us a sense of how, in a US mainstream publication, how do, leaving Me Too aside for just a moment, how do they define what is newsworthy? How do they decide what they want to sort of investigate, what is worth investigating, what is not worth investigating? And then within Me Too itself, there was a lot more detailed original journalism emanating from the US than from here, where most of the cues were just picked up from Twitter and so has said this.
Well, the interesting, I want to look at how, the question of how does a US news organization decide what to cover is almost an unanswerable question, so I'll look at it, if you don't mind, through the filter of Me Too. These stories, that obviously, they're, despite the fact that just since, it's coming now 3 years since the Harvey Weinstein story, and which changed everything. Which isn't to say that before then there weren't other stories and there wasn't other reporting about men behaving badly, probably most famously Bill Cosby. but it required a critical mass of women who were willing to come forward and be named to change everything. And what happened with Weinstein, which was an open secret, not just in Hollywood, but among, frankly, millions of people, undoubtedly, was that there was the fear and intimidation, particularly from the emanating from the Weinstein organization, against anyone that tried to cover or talk publicly about what was happening, really shut down coverage. And there were not enough women who were willing to stand up and be named and not be anonymous. So it wasn't until, I guess it was autumn of 2017, that the Times, and together with the New Yorker, were able to find enough women to go on the record. And you need that critical mass because women were afraid of being either against retribution or being told that they were liars. So once the critical mass of women came forward, then of course that took the cork out of the bottle, and we have everything that we have today. For news organizations, it really comes down to, a lot of it comes down to the issue of anonymity, and this has been something that news organizations struggle with a lot, which is how do you tell a big breaking investigative piece with all anonymous sources? And I think that had been previously a challenge in coverage of sexual assault. So I think that really changed a lot, and it also enabled many other women to come forward on the record.
And Padmapriya, you set up the Women in Cinema Collective long before Me Too. What was the impetus behind setting it up? How did the media respond to it? And what was the sort of pushback you got from the industry? And that journey's kind of been somewhat longer than, what some of the rest of us are talking about. So just take us through that a little bit.
Yeah. I think quite in contrast to what Vivian said and what we saw in the West, it was not the critical mass. It was just an instance of one woman standing up in circumstances of one of our colleagues was basically raped and sexually assaulted on her way to work, and there were circumstances which were obvious that the driver was from the industry. And this was in a moving vehicle. So the driver was from the industry, the person who assaulted her and recorded her was from the industry, and there were some other linkages which are still being tried in the court. So it kind of caught the imagination of many in a very strong way within the Kerala community, right? This happened in the Kerala film industry. And a few of us actually came together very, very randomly to say, how can we support her? Because none of us have gone through legal proceedings. And this woman was like, I remember everything, I'm going to stand by it. And in circumstances where she was, as we always see, victim shaming, where people said that she must have, including the lead police investigating officer, who said that she must have paid to get assaulted. To things like that. So, it's in those circumstances we came together and we said, okay, how can we get her a prosecutor who can do the job well? Can we maintain date diary? And then suddenly all of us over lemon tea realized, that was our little Me Too moment. And we went very, very innocently to the Chief Minister of Kerala with a list of demands, including equal pay, because we realized that in many ways, something as heinous like this comes because there is a series of smaller crimes which get ignored. And those kind of manifest in the kind of payments you get, the kind of representation you get on set. It doesn't matter whether you're a lead female actor, because at the end on the set, you're just treated like every other person who is not the male lead actor, right? Or the male director. So I think this was the power shift that we all started seeking for, and that's how the Women in Cinema Collective came about. If you look at how the Andhra film industry, it was one instance, and then a few other instances not from an actor level at all. It happened at, a few of supporting dancers who came out in the media against a very, very big director and producer, led to today there are government policies which are being made around this. But when we talk about, I want to talk about the media aspect of this, because all three of them out here are writers, journalists in many ways. And I also live in Delhi. Honestly, there has been really, how many of you really know about the Women in Cinema Collective and what we do? That's the truth. We couldn't have survived it because of the media. We survived it only because of the media, because we were fighting not just this person who is a very big actor who's allegedly accused, but it was the behavior of many other much bigger actors and directors and producers who were stopping work for us, who were stopping everything, stopping support for the woman getting justice, in spite of having come out decoratively in support of her, right? And this is where it's important to realize that unlike in the US, we do not have a unified code of media here. We have the Southern India media, you have the social media, and then you have the India media, I don't know what to call it, right? And the Delhi media, and apart from, and apart from lone rangers like Anna Vetikard, we really got no support. At times when this could have actually snowballed to, and then at times when we really needed a lot of support, and there was extreme vitriolism. It was like, almost like these are colleagues I have worked for like a decade with, and they would look at me and make statements about me and my colleagues in public, like we never mattered. In spite of the fact that all our movies worked together, we have engaged very, very deeply creatively together. And so I think there's this dichotomy of and that's where probably, we move from page 3 to page 1. I owe it big time to the Southern India media, because from being called a tsunami, from being called, I think this coinage is really important, because this is not a passe. There have been many women even before this who have made major shifts, men and women, who have made major shifts and increments which have led to a Me Too movement, which has led to a movement where we stop feeling guilty about being harassed, and the society starts feeling guilty for having created an ecosystem for harassment, right? And I think what all the 4 Southern film industries in some which way have made a shift is to challenge that notion, is to move from page 3 to page 1. We actually have, while it's extremely important for Ramani's case to be highlighted all the time, how many of us really know that there's a public interest litigation going on for implementation of the POSH Act, which has happened centuries back, which has been filed against the entire Kerala film industry? How many of us know that the Telugu film industry has actually lobbied, the women have actually very smartly lobbied, along with NGO activists, to make sure that their government policy is put in place, as much as it's happening in Kerala. First time there has been an amount which has been set aside for production, which can be executed by women for bringing more gender narratives, which brings gender representation, and both in terms of the number of people who work and the kind of narratives that are presented. So I think this kind of narrative change has happened in the South. We thought actually when the Me Too movement hit in India, and the way the Bollywood industry worked, we thought, and it was a major success for us, because at that time we were having these weird negotiations with our own colleagues. I don't want to get into descriptions because we have very limited time. And they were left, right, and center, people being removed from the top, people being removed. We thought, wow, Bombay is doing so well. But strangely, there has been nothing constructive which has happened out there. And that's really surprising, and that pretty much describes why, except for a few, I should not say, do a wide stroke on this, but the Scriptwriters Association has been doing some fantabulous work. But it's by and far very less compared to what's happening in the 4 Southern industries. There is not even any media introspection from the North, from which represents the majority of the country, to say that these are possibilities, these are solutions, that we are not just crying about X person or Y person violating, which definitely needs justice, but we are also talking about an equal space and opportunity at work, which is our right, and that this is a gender issue, that this is about lack of equality at workspace.
Sorry, can I just, listening to Padmapriya also reminded me that even though I unqualifiedly said that, the traditional media kind of fell down on some of the stuff that social media managed to do really well, I think that needs to be qualified by the fact that the narrative in the Malayalam film industry also shows us, correct me if I'm wrong please, that powerful men can twist social media to their own advantage in really disquieting ways. So because you have enormous fan clubs for powerful male superstars in the Malayalam film industry. The amount of pushback that women, both the accuser herself in the rape case and all the women actors who have supported her, has been really stark, really severe. And because you can say things on social media, you can push boundaries of politeness on social media that you can't in traditional media. Some of that has been really, it's been a form of assault in its own way.
And it's especially disheartening because you can imagine the mainstream media standing with the industry because of trivial reasons like, oh, we will lose access and so on, so you stand with the establishment. But when you see social media also shut down, I have a sort of a larger question, and from this point on, please any of you jump in, which is that one of the misconceptions of the Me Too movement among many people, and I think the way the media also handled it, is that it's about all these instances. You have an instance where a woman complains of being harassed or assaulted by someone, and it's one instance after another. And what it sometimes gets ignored there is that beyond all these instances, there is also a ubiquitous toxicity in our workplaces, in the way men behave with women, a lot of which needs introspection and journalism, none of which is happening. All the journalism seems to be about, oh, so-and-so has been sacked by his company, or so-and-so is writing a column again for somebody. But it's not just about the instances. Like you said, it's about the whole culture sort of changing.
So soon after the October wave broke, I did some workshops in a media house. And, I feel it's very almost cute, the way men are very shocked. This has been happening. I'm so disturbed that it's been happening and I didn't know. And I'm like, you should be very disturbed and you should not be saying it in this way. But I think that the really overwhelming absence of serious reflection, I would say, right? So there's this kind of sentimental reflection that, oh my God, on the one hand, alarm, we don't know what to do now. How close should we stand? Should I not talk to a female colleague? I'm not going to have any women colleagues, etc. Which I'm just like, how old are you? And like grown up, people have been working for 25, 30 years. Of course, I encountered within that space people who genuinely wanted to rethink. Yes, I couldn't understand why they hadn't understood what was going on before, but they were willing to rethink and reformulate the way they were working, and there was a genuine empathy and kindness in them. But on the whole, what you see is that the media is very empathetic and sympathetic to men because we have all been brought up to think that only the interiority of men matters, right? Women's interiority is not present. We don't know how to see the world from the point of view of men, of women. So, men who have been accused and maybe had some loss of cultural capital because of Me Too, if they post a video about their mental health, everybody wants to write about it, including the traditional media. But the mental health of women who have stood up and spoken up, nobody has bothered to do a story about that. Like in all the mental health stories that will happen in October because it's Mental Health Awareness Month, I wonder if somebody will do a story about what happened to the women who spoke up in Me Too and how they're feeling, right? So this larger kind of reflection, that's one. And the second is that we haven't seen anybody writing an op-ed about we really need to think about the workspaces we have and how toxic they are. We haven't seen any media houses doing a very important thing, looking at how they contribute to this culture of masculine supremacy. How many cover stories have only men and hardly ever women? What kind of women get to be on the cover? What is this notion of this alpha man who doesn't, doesn't dress formally and then doesn't follow any rules and does whatever he wants? He lives from his groin and conquers the world. I mean, this is a thing that we are endorsing day after day after day on every page of the newspaper and everything, all over the media. So I think there's got to be a very deep philosophical reflection, and we're not seeing that serious thing happening at all.
And also, sorry.
Actually, I also wanted to, it's been our experience at WCC because we are a combination of not just actors who are more in public limelight, but also makeup artists, singers and writers, lyricists. And recently there was an international fashion magazine which came and wants to do a cover story. And we said that we all want to be on the cover page. And they said, oh, but we can only have 4 or 5 people. And they actually approached only 4 or 5 people. And they did it in a hurry. It's been in conversation for the last 8 months, and they suddenly wake up. So what I'm also trying to say, it's become a bit fashionable, which is nice, which is nice because we've moved beyond this horizon of saying that, I am the culprit of my own harassment. But it's also become a little fashionable to talk about it instead of being introspective and finding deeper, more important solutions, which I feel has been more in the case of the West, because in a way, the focus on justice is there. Right? I mean, a focus on the justice of the past allegations, good or bad, whether some of the harassment claims on, Weinstein, whether it was right or wrong, all of it's getting coverage. And that's extremely important as well, because the narrative has to get its right justice. But back here in India, it's really not happened. We had Kailash Kher performing exactly 2.5 months after being arrested or after being accused, and being supported and being state supported for that performance. And there was no media coverage. So I'm not saying that you need to end the life of the career of that person. That's not the kind of justice we are looking at. But at least have a conversation about it. At least say, how would you like to deal with it? And don't make it a fashion statement which is meant to be there at that point of time and brought out.
I'll just reflect on an interesting dynamic that's happening in the United States. On the one hand, there has been just an incredible positive movement towards greater representation. And all of this is tied together. The Me Too is tied together to representation and inclusivity. So there's been tremendous rise in awareness and positive movement in the United States on that front, across media, across many sectors, across many industries. At the same time, this is the odd paradox of what's happening in the United States right now. The President of the United States, who bragged in his presidential campaign about committing assault and was then nonetheless elected, continues to lead, this other half of the population for whom a lot of that represents sort of the backlash or rejection of what they would call political correctness, but one would, I would call a very sort of a bigoted point of view around issues of women being harassed, around race and inclusivity. So we've got these two different forces that are both happening in tandem, an extreme move towards progressivism when it comes to these issues, and quite the opposite. And but that context is really important, and I meant to say in my earlier answer that I don't think it's an accident that the opening up of Me Too, starting with the Harvey Weinstein story, I've really bubbled up out of this nationwide rage that was starting to be felt by many people after Trump became elected.
And I'm just thinking aloud here, does the increasing polarization in our discourse, where everything is reduced to a binary and you take one side or the other, does that perhaps also affect how Me Too is covered? Because, for example, if you see Me Too as an issue for the progressives and the wokes, then the other side will reflexively position itself on the other side. Do you think that's a possibility?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, we see, yes. The answer is yes. There is that kind of backlash, and we see it even in mainstream media in the U.S., where you have, statistically speaking, according to research that I've seen, less than 5% of accusations of harassment or assault are proven to be false claims. And yet, those stories, when it does happen, or stories of perhaps, an exaggerated case, something that isn't really assault, but, a bad date, those get a lot of national attention because there is a hunger in some corners for stories that are like, aha, you see what's happening here? There are very fine people on both sides. Right. So, it's a quite a phrase.
These leftist men, right?
Exactly.
Amit, I'm interested in the question of that particular divide, but I think what's very starkly evident over here is that political polarization. In some ways, whoever is given a free pass or not, we can come to that later. But the divide over here, as perhaps it has been in every mainstream media conversation about Me Too, is about who seems which women seem worth representing more than others, right? And that divide has been as stark, perhaps starker in India than it has been in the States. The part of it, of course, is due to we had a really good panel on caste representation in the media yesterday, and which really spoke to how people from marginal communities are represented in the media and the kind of jobs that they get in the media. But let's also leave that aside, because there's another media panel here later this afternoon, which is about whether we should call ourselves out or not. And I'm sure there are going to be some people over there on that panel who kind of wind around to the idea that maybe we shouldn't. Are we even equipped to write about workspaces and cultural spaces in which women from marginal communities operate, if not the media? We know that very few Dalit women, for example, or Adivasi women get a chance in Latin's media, if you like. You said it, not me. But can we write about shop floors, about factories, about law offices, about the corporate sector? And I think the answer to that is very, very limited, right? Because there are very few news organizations that are used to holding these institutions to account. And increasingly, there are very, very few that believe that these organizations will get them the kind of attention from readers that they want, which is a very, very big problem for us to resolve. We have to find a way to do that. I'm not sure that we've approached that yet.
I'm told we have to go to the Q&A session, so let's kind of begin. There's a very enthusiastic gentleman there. Yeah, only women. Okay, women first. Okay, this gentleman is very enthusiastic. But
I'm a woman at heart.
Just the one rule I'd make, though.
Never say that again.
Just
it's nice, compassion.
Just the one rule I'd make, though, is that this is not a session about Me Too per se. It's a session about how the media covered Me Too.
Yeah.
So let's stick to that.
So I'm going to just actually get to the specifics of media and Me Too. Yeah. You talked about instances, and you said it's more than the instances, and I totally agree. But there is an omission in one of the most important instances, which is our Prime Minister. Our Harvey Weinstein is actually the Prime Minister. He went after Mansi Soni. The media is totally silent. So I'd like to hear your view on this. I have a quick question for the American panelists. You had the Kavanaugh case in America, right? The US Supreme Court judge who was accused. We have a sitting Chief Justice of India, again, Ranjan Gogoi. He's done exactly what happened, the main accused in the Unnao rape case has done, He's our sitting Chief Justice. Nobody talks about it. Again, the media is silent. So the way out, how do you engage? Padmapriya, for you, the quickest question. Okay, the two main leading actors in Kerala, Mammootty and Mohanlal, they haven't taken a stand. What do you have to say about that?
Okay, and no more questions from men. You asked 3, that's a male quota over. I think there were questions.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the Me Too, the coverage of the Me Too, and I also had been invited by The Wire to write a piece from the perspective of marginalized women. And I was pointing out that, and the general idea was that the struggle of Dalit women for justice is being obscured by the Me Too controversy. It looks like a good example of the truth. But I was pointing out that every struggle that began for access to justice for women in this area have been triggered by the work, the life, or the experiences of Dalit and Adivasi women. Namely, Mathura in the law reform, and Bhavri Devi in the case of the Vishaka and the Posh Act, and so many other cases. Women have, for the Unnao case, women from the marginalized community are the one who show the gumption to fight. It's the media and the society that haven't responded the way they should have. I just want to make this point very clear.
I agree with you, and I'd also say that this panel should have been more representative as it is.
Absolutely. So we've already made that point very clear yesterday.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is to Padma. Actually, you mentioned about you mentioned about Kailash Kher being not questioned after 2 months of the accuse. This happened with many of the AIB founders as well and the other content aggregators. So, what do you think? Like, how could it have been different? Like, you mentioned that of course we don't want them to lose their career, but that's not something that we are looking at. But then I just want you to elaborate on that piece a little more. Like, how could the media do, because they never covered about them coming back to their careers back and taking them, because it was just a mere Twitter statement that was released by them, nothing else. So
I think we'll answer these questions and then take some more.
I want to say that the general attitude of the legacy media towards covering the state, towards the leaders who govern its most important institutions, does not become null and void in the case of something like the Me Too conversation. It is inherently disruptive, which is why we hold it to higher standards, or to hold it to standards that everything else should be held to. I don't really know if you need an answer from any of us about why the Prime Minister or the Home Minister, who has been accused of aiding in the stalking of a young woman, or who was accused at one point in his career, haven't become page one stories yet. I mean, we know why, right? There are certain kinds of page one stories that are written, and Me Too accusations are not part of that.
I think I just want a quick answer. I really don't want to respond to the Mohanlal Mammootty question, because I think this is about, we were talking about media and Me Too, and I think we should really focus on that. We will get into various conversations, we can take it offline. As to the lady's question, I don't think media should be out there claiming judgment on whether Kailash Kher is performing or not. They should be questioning on why he should or why he should not. They should ask, and they should create an environment for debate and questioning. Especially in this case, primarily, it was not like in other cases, it was not. This was a state-sponsored event, right? And this was a state-sponsored event by a party which I really support, I have a lot of affection for. And just 2 weeks before, presented T.M. Krishna's concert using public money. And I think, why was there not an investigation from the media to talk about why public money is being used to stage a show of a Me Too accused in such a big platform? And I think that question needed to be raised. I'm not saying the judgment of how Kailash Kher needs to be dealt with. And I think that's the shift we have tried to do with WCC. I think that's the shift which many of the Andhra, the kind of people in the industry, media industry from Andhra Pradesh are trying to do. We were trying to just change the nature of discourse. We don't want you to call us controversies and scandals and solution givers on media. We want you to bring well-researched articles on power dynamics, on structures, on institutions, on people who do not take stands in positions of power that they are supposed to take. And I think that's the direction we should look at going with respect to the media engagement.
So I actually have a problem with this term Me Too accused. And I really think that it's incredibly lazy journalism. And I mean, I know it's easy shorthand, but why can we not say accused of sexual assault, accused of rape, accused of sexual harassment? When you just say Me Too accused in a headline or whatever, half of your audience, half of your readership will switch off, and and the other half will say, it's lazy journalism, but they'll read it because they're interested. But it trivializes the whole thing, right? And can all journalists not just make it a standard rule that Me Too is a movement, but what they're accused of is not the movement. What they're accused of is sexual harassment or assault. So, I just want to know, what you guys think, because you were talking about how coinage is important. And the way we use language every day, it also affects how people think about the movement, right?
Absolutely.
That's a very sharp point, and I think we all agree. So,
yeah.
Right.
Sorry, just to add to that, I think you are entirely right, and we are all in agreement. I think maybe that is one area in which legacy media did commit an important mistake, which was, or rather, made a mistake that had some important consequences, which is that people who were out of kind of the direct flow of the conversation, of the Me Too conversations on social media, had very little idea of what was going on. And seeing headlines like X, Y, and Z accused in Me Too, when X was accused of a violent sexual assault, Y was accused of mishandling a sexual harassment complaint at the workplace he leads, and Z made an off-color remark when drunk to someone at an office party, gave people like many aunts and uncles I've spoken to, for example, the mistaken impression that this isn't really all that important, right? And and let's remember, these are people, especially our aunts and our mothers and people like this, right? These are people who face this stuff themselves and who for years have either been silently angry about it or more likely normalized it in some ways, so that their first response to many of them, their first response to us is to say, oh, well, this happened to us too. Why can't you just get on with it? I think changing those hearts and minds was something that legacy media could have done, and that I don't think really happened. Do you?
I mean, just to, because we must end, I suppose, but it's that the way in which a lot of Me Too related stories were covered was actually in this noirish sort of way, right? Like there has been occurrence of an incident, which is why, and never linking it to the larger systemic issues in the same article. Yeah. So there will be an occurrence of this incident, it's another Me Too incident has flared up, right, and we're reporting on that, and then it's never adding any backstory or contextual story. And I think that is also why they always use the Me Too term and not talk about sexual harassment. Yeah.
Paromita, I think I just want to quickly wrap this on that note. I'm so sorry. I know we're short of time. Is that, and this is where it becomes really important to cover what's happening in the media and television and cinema industry back down in the South, because all the 4 film industries are actually unionizing, not just to address the past, and see what kind of justice can be given, whether it's a Chinmayi, whether it's a Shruti Hariharan in Karnataka through fire, whether it's Sri Reddy, what happened with her, and a host of others who came out, and a lot of other people like Jhanvi and stuff in the Telugu film industry have come together and actually trying to find solutions around it, not just for the past, what has happened, but also to see what's the future discourse. And I think unless we look at it that way and find systemic answers to how women are going about finding their own solutions in the industry and space, which is extremely driven by power and patriarchy, is only when we're going to be able to navigate change in the discourse, and we start looking at the issues deeply then.
I'll quickly end by quoting a slogan from Shupriya's bag, which is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So, on that note.